It is a combination that we're seeing people really try to lean into more and more, which is we're going to try to play complementary football, which mostly means we're going to try to run the ball, sit on it as much as we can, and then play defense and try to take away that one thing, not necessarily that you do well, like you're pointing out with Quinn, but that thing we know could break us, that thing that we know could hurt us. Oklahoma, Texas, always one of the best rivalry games in the sport, but particularly when you got a number one ranked Oklahoma or a number one ranked Texas, it's always going to be a game that people want to see. However, the night game is Ohio State at Oregon. And I circled that one way back when Oregon entered the Big Ten for no other reason than what Dan Lanning has been able to build over there and what Oregon has showed here historically. Like, it was a different regime at Oregon, but they went to Columbus not long ago and got themselves a W without Kayvon Thibodeau on the field, CJ Verdell running wild. Now you have what we think is the best Ohio State team we've seen since 2019, walking into an Autzen that is historically a really difficult place to win with an Oregon team that has some things to prove to the rest of us. So off the top, what is it that you're looking for in this matchup of top four opponents?
What I'm looking for is to see what Vegas is seeing. Right now, they're seeing a 3-point game, which if you didn't look at the number and you just said, hey, random college football fan who actually watches college football and doesn't just have a bunch of NFL stuff on their Twitter profile, what do you think about these two teams and how this game's going to play out? They're going to say, oh, Ohio State's going to kill them. And, just it has that feeling of like that's what it's supposed to be. But I don't know that we know everything because Vegas is saying, no, it's a 3-4 point game. And so, yes, Ohio State looks like that monster. And Josh and I both, we do a top 10 every week. And in this week, we had Ohio State number 1 ahead of Texas in our top 10, partly because of, going back to Texas, that Mississippi State game, I don't think was a great performance. Conversely, Ohio State second half Iowa was a great performance. First halves, they've been struggling a little bit. 7-0 at the half, and your 7 points came out of your script. That's a little bit concerning. It's a road game. It's, they played one game away from home this year. It was Michigan State, and, I don't imagine that was a too terrifying atmosphere. What I want to see in this game is, can Howard press their offense vertically, or is it just an efficiency game? And I want to see if these two defenses are as legit as so far the numbers have shown. And it's really tough because they haven't played great teams. You got one that gave up 7 to Michigan State, one that gave up 10. They haven't played great teams. Honestly, Boise's the best team between both of them. And at first, when we saw that game, we're like, oh, crap, Oregon sucks. But I think that we're seeing now that, one, it was just a little bit of sleepiness at the beginning of the year, but two, between the two of these teams, that's the one good team they've played. So I want to see if these two defenses hold up against what I think are two good offenses, but I also am curious if, it's hard to know how good two teams are when the game against one another is the only game that they've played that's of substance. And I'm curious to see if one unit, so you've got 4 units, 2 offense, 2 defense on both sides of the ball, or both teams, if one of those units just completely falters, one of those 4. Because that's the only way we're going to come out of this, knowing that either one team was a fraud, or if one team wins close, we're just going to think they're both really good and really not know much out of it all.
It would also give us a great answer as to who really does have the best defense in college football, because we've seen a lot of good defensive play. We haven't seen one program do what Georgia had done or Iowa had done in years past, where they're just, hey, this is what they're able to do. I know there's lots of contenders for this, but I think you bring up a very good point. This is an opportunity for Ohio State and Oregon to face good offenses, if not great offenses, and show us what they're really working with. I want to pick on the Will Howard bit for the same reason I want to pick on the Dylan Gabriel bit, because these are two guys that get 7th round draft grades, maybe undrafted grades, who are leading programs that should be in the college football playoff and hope to win national championships based on what they are as a veteran presence, their ability to understand what they see on the football field. And if you're Will Howard, I've said this, and I don't mind telling you, Daniel, it's Will Howard doesn't have to convince me vertically, because all he's got to do is be Craig Krenzel, because they are that talented literally everywhere else. I don't know that that's the same example I would lay over the top of Dylan Gabriel, because that dude is just really great with his decision making, and that wide receiving core is great. Say nothing of what Jordan James showed us against Michigan State. But I do think the two are comparable. So in as far as the quarterbacks are concerned, I think we agree that we're a little bit more concerned about Will Howard than we are Dylan Gabriel. But after what I saw against Michigan State, I'm asking this sincerely. Why don't I just bring 5 every single time I can? Maybe 6 against Dylan Gabriel, who seems to have regressed when it comes to throwing against pressure.
I think that the key is, and to me, Josh and I did a preview of this game, and the thought here was, if Dylan Gabriel doesn't turn the ball over, how much of a just complete cosmic shift does this have on what this team is in this game? Because a lot of their struggles so far, and even really if you look back his entire career, a lot of the struggles are he can play hero ball, but that hero ball is going to come with a tax, and it's a turnover tax. But I got it kind of in an argument with some Ohio State people on Twitter, because a lot of them are so used to a CJ Stroud or Justin Fields who can just completely take over a game, who can put up 40, 50 points if they need to against a really good opponent. And they don't need that anymore. The trickle down from the NFL, the defenses that are being played in college football now, it is not 2018. It is not 2019 anymore. You don't have RPO offenses that you have to be able to score 40 plus against to win in a big game. Right now, Will Howard has to play just within this offense, which I think schemes a lot of things for him easy. Chip Kelly knows what he's doing, and he's probably enjoying not having to head coach and deal with all the other crap, just focus on offense. But yeah, I mean, I think Craig Krenzel is probably a little bit of a stretch, because again, we don't know if these teams have elite defenses or they just haven't played nobody. But I think some of that is gonna show Saturday, and really, it's just, to me, can you avoid turnovers, and can you avoid successive 3-and-outs? Because to me, that's just as bad as a turnover.
I'm curious to find out what Jeremiah Smith can do in this game, and I'm going to focus on Jeremiah Smith because that is the way they talk about him at Columbus from the moment he stepped on. So many different quotes that get to who this guy is. Number 4 being a true freshman, being your number 2 wide receiver. But I'm stuck on Chip Kelly saying he showed up at 17 and he could play on any NFL team you want him to right now. And we're seeing flashes of that. We had the fumble, but we're also seeing the one-handed grabs. And more than that, we're seeing Chip Kelly trust him and Will Howard trust him in the way that it feels like they trust Emeka Egbuka, who was also number 1 coming out of high school in his class at that position, to say nothing of what Brandon Ennis might be able to do, Carnell Tate might be able to do. If you are Ohio State and you have this weapon over here, how much do you think of using him as a decoy now that we know that they're going to pay attention to him? Or is he just going to be a part of the offense that you run naturally against a really quality opponent?
I think that there's probably some left in the bag offensively. We asked this question when Alabama went in to play Georgia. Van Dyke going down in the Wisconsin game probably helped them not have to come out of their bag at all, and they kind of sprung it on Georgia. And I think Ohio State in that same way. They haven't had any close games. I think there's probably 40% of this offense you haven't seen a lot of, namely, what have we seen from the tight ends? What have we seen that hasn't been just on the nose offensive football? And there's probably some of that there. But look, I think he's that dude. I think I don't even think there's a decoy necessary. I will say this is not a Ohio State wide receiver room that you've seen over the last few years. And that's not a shot to him. It's kind of like when you play a bunch of teams that aren't any good, that doesn't mean you're bad. Just because he came into a wide receiver room and was able to shoot up the charts to number 1 as a freshman doesn't mean he's bad, or doesn't mean he's not as good as people say he is. But it might speak a little bit at the same time to an offensive or a wide receiver room that, Egbuka, if he was elite as he was as his, recruiting status, he would have already been in the NFL, right? So there's a reason why he's still here. But that's not to say that you can't have one, alpha 1A guy that elevates everybody else because he gets his, but is it effectively a decoy every play he doesn't get his?
Speaking with Daniel at College Football Nerds on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Daniel and Josh have been doing this for a very long time, and I am always learning something new from the two of them. Anytime they want to tell me about what they predict and what they preview, go check out the channel. Daniel, who's going to be the number one team in the country on Sunday?
It's interesting because let's say these two games play out, the two marquee games play out the way that Vegas says they're playing out. Do you give more credit to Texas, who beats a brand? Say what you want about Oklahoma. I said coming in the season 8-4, but largely because of the schedule, not because of the roster. That's a good staff. That's a well-recruited team. They've got dudes on that roster. If you beat an Oklahoma, let's say by 2 touchdowns, versus if you beat an Oregon on the road by 3, like which one do you weigh more? Because we're talking about Texas and we're talking about Ohio State. To me, I'd probably lean towards the Oregon win as putting Ohio State as number 1. But man, that's tough because I think it's tough to beat a rival in the middle of the season, coming off a bye week, comfortably. Like that is really hard to do. So I also will say that we've seen enough from Oklahoma to know who they are, and who they are isn't a bad team. We don't know everything we need to know about Oregon. So it could be that Ohio State gets a ton of hype from beating Oregon, and Oregon goes on to lose 2 or 3 more games this year. But then they keep that credit for beating the number 3 team in the country, which is tough. For me, I would lean towards Ohio State, and I would also say that it probably doesn't matter because 74 teams get in the playoffs anyway.
I think you are right. The way that I couched this was Alabama was nowhere near what we thought as the number 1 team in the country until such a time as they beat Georgia, and that was good enough, right?
Right.
I think you're going to reward the team that beats the higher-ranked opponent, full stop. Whether that be OU, Texas, or Oregon, Ohio State, I think Oklahoma would see a significant jump if they were to beat Texas. I think Texas is marginal. You're the number 1 team. There's nowhere to go. All you can do is cover the spread here. But if you are Oregon and you beat Ohio State at home and you beat them by whatever the spread is, I think you're going to default to number 1. Texas is going to move to number 2, and vice versa, frankly. Ohio State goes into Austin and does what a lot of people can't do, get a win there. It's going to count. But to your point, 12 teams in the playoff, but more than that, I think we're going to see number 1 change hands at least half a dozen more times because of what Vanderbilt has put into motion for all of us, frankly. I'm so enthusiastic about this sport, and I wanted to give this to you before we get to our last game, though. Does 2024 kind of rhyme with 2007 for you, or is that just us having this recent memory?
I think it's very 2007-like without the stakes, because that's BCS era. That's an era where the stakes couldn't be higher. You only get 2 teams to play for it. And still you get to lose a bunch of games and make it in. That was such an aberration. And it's interesting because a lot of people are saying it's parity, and Josh and I are both saying it's volatility, because Vanderbilt's roster is nowhere near Alabama's roster. Vanderbilt won because of a certain confluence of events that all went their way, and they deserve complete credit for it. But Vanderbilt isn't competing with Alabama for players, and they still won't be even after this win. Arkansas the same. I don't think we have a ton of parity still, but what I do think we have is, in at least in the short term, we have a fairly exciting scenario where, because we have the expanded playoffs, we have this ability to make a mistake on judging quality. And it's going to happen because of how disjointed and how imbalanced scheduling is. So you have some teams with super hard schedules, some people with super easy schedules. All of them might have this room to lose 1 or 2 games and still prove it at the end. So for that reason, I'm happy for the expansion. But it also gives us a situation where the season is very backloaded, because if it doesn't feel like anybody's played yet. You got Alabama, Georgia. Like, even, do you remember that LSU played USC this year? Like, does anybody remember that game? It felt like it had a lot of gravity in the moment, but now that's kind of lost a lot. But going down the stretch, it's going to be both crazy and super interesting, and super conferences have somewhat created that, but it's also concentrated that interest in the Big Ten and the SEC in a way that I don't think I love.